So as folks trickle in, I'm going to start with introductions and also with a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to acknowledge that McMaster University, as well as my home, are located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and the Haudenosaunee nations, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And I'd also like to acknowledge that it's important that we seek new relationship with the original peoples of these lands, particularly based in honor and deep respect. And to begin, I would also then like to introduce our speaker today. So Candyce Hamel is a senior epidemiologist at the Canadian Association for Radiologists, with a deep interest in applying machine learning to review processes, various kinds of reviews, um, and has a methodological expertise as well. And so I'm going to ask Candyce then to take it away. And thanks everybody for joining us so early in the
Yeah. Excuse me. Hi, everyone. Okay.
And I think if people have questions, you can feel free to use the chat. And if they're burning questions, if you want to raise your hands and use all the
Yeah,
wonderful Zoom functions.
please. Yes, we can make this interactive because I love talking about AI and how it can help you in your reviews. I know it's changed my life. So happy to take questions at any times or discuss, or we can wait to the end, whatever. Okay. So just a couple of declarations. First, I am a co-convener with the Cochrane Rapid Review Methods Group and an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa in the School of Epidemiology and Public Health. I don't have any conflicts to declare. I'm just going to minimize this. Okay, so I mean, I just grabbed, these are the tools that I found in this area that have AI. There's probably many more. There were a few that I couldn't grab because they didn't have logos. But just to show, there are many different tools that are available that are integrating AI within the process. Most of them are integrating the AI into the title and abstract screening portion. It's quite well developed. That's been underway for at least 10 years now that computer programmers have been working on that. And there's also other software that integrates it in other aspects, such as Robot Reviewer. It uses it for the risk of bias. It answers basically the first 4 questions in the Cochrane Risk of Bias 1 tool. So there are many tools and others, and the level of sophistication differs. For example, Abstractor, the AI learns from itself once every 24 hours, whereas other software tools such as Distiller, PicoPortal, it's always relearning throughout the entire process. So often the level of sophistication is also linked to the level of cost that you pay for the software. But just to say, not all softwares are equal in this area. So the first part of the presentation is really going to be on some of the initial work we did in the May 2020 release of Distiller. Most of my examples are going to be in Distiller because that's the software that I use. I know other softwares may or may not have the same features that Distiller does, but I'll try to keep it generic where I can. But in 2020, May of 2020, Distiller released their software. They had an AI version in previous releases, but it was based on different features. So in this version they released, and they allowed for different tools with the AI. So they had the simulation tool built into this version. And so you're able to use that simulation tool retrospectively. So you can go back on systematic reviews or scoping reviews that you've already done and test to see how the AI would have performed. So that's the first thing that we did. And then once we did that, we were able, Distiller is an Ottawa-based company. We've been working with them for, over 15 years. So we were able to, I was able to talk to the CTO, Chief Technology Officer, the guy who basically developed the whole machine learning in the software. So I was able to talk to him and really get into the weeds on how it all worked. So through all this and through, using it in I was at the OHRI, so the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, in the knowledge synthesis unit for 7.5 years. So we did tons of evidence reviews. So we were able to start, practicing and using it and figuring out and ironing out the details on how, we can best use this and really use it to our advantage. So after that, we developed this guidance, because a lot of people want to use artificial intelligence, but they may not know really how to integrate it into the process. So we kind of wrote a generic guidance document to try to help with this. So first, we needed to see, can we trust this AI as much as we want to, as much as we know that it could make our life easier? Can we trust it? Does it actually do what we want it to do? So that's the first paper. So our main objective was, using this AI simulation tool, we wanted to evaluate the reduction in the screening burden. So how many records did we not need to screen when we used a recall of 95%, and this is a number that that has been published to be quite high. Typically 95, when it says that you've reached 95% of the included records, typically you're really at 98, 99, or 100%. The advantage of this is, because we were using retrospective, we actually knew for certain that it was a true recall of 95%, because all the records had already been screened. So what we did is we wanted to test the screening reduction, and we wanted to see what the performance was. So among the 5% of the records that were not yet identified as included, we thought, well, these are the kind of last 5%. So they're probably ones that were included, but maybe we were over inclusive, and they weren't records that so the included at the title and abstract level. We wanted to test, well, were these 5% of the records that were not yet identified, were they actually included in the final review? So after title and abstract screening, were they actually included? So just to show how the AI works, and this is Distiller, and like I said, it might differ slightly for other softwares. So basically, it takes 2% of the records, and these records are presented randomly to the user, and you screen these 2%. And in Distiller, it's 2% or 25 to 200, a minimum of 25 to a maximum of 200 records. If you have a massive data set, 2% can be quite large, so it maxes out at 200. So you screen those. The AI learns based on that iteration of those records. Then it goes through all of the records, assigns a value to, and this is all done in the background, assigns a value of the prediction of whether it's included or not, from 0 to 100. And then it reorganizes the records and presents the records to the user in that order of likelihood of inclusion. You screen the next 2% of the records. Using that 4%, it then does the same process. It assigns all unreviewed records a number of likelihood of inclusion, and then it shows the remaining records to the users in that order of likelihood of inclusion. So this kind of goes through this process, and this is how it worked with the simulation tool, but this is how it would also work in actual practice. So what we did, we grabbed 10 completed systematic reviews. We had a criteria that the review had to have at least 2,000 records. If a review has 1,000 records, that's fairly quick to screen through. And although you could use AI, you're not going to get huge time savings, because doesn't take that long to screen through 1,000 records. So we said 2,000 records or higher. We ran each review 10 times through the simulation tool for each of the 10 reviews. So we had a total of 10 simulations. And we did this mostly the programmer told us, you don't really need to do this, but because the first 2% of the records are selected at random, we just figured, well, let's do it 10 times over and see what we get. So this is the output in the simulation tool. And you can really see on the top diagram that, and each dot is an iteration. So that 2% or that 25 to 200 records. So you can see the first iteration, it captured 3 of the studies that or the records that we included. And then it learned quite steeply, 1633. You can see the line is quite steep. And you can see at a certain point, it really starts to flatline. That 45-degree line is basically what they're assuming how you would capture included records if you were to just screen at random. So it really shows how much. And so we said, well, at the first iteration where it has identified 95% of the included studies, we only had to review 32 of the excluded studies by this point. So it really had a reduction in the screening burden here. The bottom diagram, it also has a table and it shows you all the information. So your number of iterations, how many includes it found, how many excludes, and so on. And then it has a histogram and it shows you of the remaining records at that point that had not been screened. You can see that all of them fall within that 0 to 9% the predicted likelihood of inclusion. And in the simulation tool, you also get a list of the reference IDs, that 5%. So those are the reference IDs number of the 5% that were included, but not yet captured once we hit the 95%. So that allowed us to go back and then pretty easily check, okay, well, was record 102 included in the final review, yes or no? So it actually made for quite an easy process. So, as I said, we had the 10 systematic reviews. These 10 reviews had almost 70,000 records amongst them, ranging from 2,250 to 22,309 records. And it really did offer a huge reduction in the screening burden. You can see the light blue on the chart on the right-hand screen is what we did not have to screen. What we wouldn't have had to screen, sorry, had we done this prospectively. So it was the reduction over the 10 reviews. The median was 47.1%. So we wouldn't have had to screen almost half of the included studies, which, for the 2,250 record review is not huge, but certainly for the 22,309 record review, that's quite a time savings in terms of time spent screening. So in other words, a median of 53% of the records did not need to be screened to identify 95% of the records included at the title and abstract level. But those 5% were any of them missed? Were any of them included in the actual final reviews? And the answer is no. So within the 95%, those extra 5% were really just records that people were being over-inclusive, or for example, it was a title only and or the abstract was quite vague and we were unable to determine if it was relevant or not. So that's likely what those 5% of the records were. So we thought, well, this is great. So, it's oftentimes in this area in systematic reviews, our evidence are often based on case studies. A lot of the records in Cochrane handbook are based on case studies, of studies that have looked back at 3 to 5 or 8 studies. So we felt that this was a pretty good indicator that it performed pretty well. It was accurate and it would reduce our screening burden. So how do you integrate this into your process prospectively? This diagram is in one of those the articles that were published, and so basically you just want to make sure that you have your team set up properly. It may not be all that different from how you're currently running your evidence review teams. A couple things though that you need to consider. So, not everybody trusts AI. So if you're working with knowledge users or an expert panel who are consulting you on your review, you want to make sure that they're on board with the process of how you're using AI. As I'll show in a slide coming up, the use of AI is really in a continuum. It really can go from as basic as to just showing you your records in prioritized order, and that's the only involvement it has. And you can use it all the way to it screening for you at a certain point. So, and everything in between. So we'll talk more about that later. So, when we work with library scientists to develop our search strategies, depending on the budget, or other resources such as human resources, we might actually make concessions to the search strategy, choose a date cutoff or use, other ways of reducing the number of records that we're getting from the search strategy yield. When we do it that way, the records that we're losing, we actually have no idea of what we didn't capture because we're making these concessions. However, when you don't do that and you use AI, you actually have a record of that. And there's audit tools and stuff in some of the software which will actually allow you to potentially capture these records that you might have lost if you make concessions to your search strategy. When you're developing your team, you probably want at least one senior reviewer, and senior is not necessarily in terms of years worked, it just experience, or if you want a clinical expert in the review at the beginning, because you really want to be able to identify the most relevant studies. Okay, so and prepare your database. So you want to remove all duplicates. I mean, this isn't any different than what you would probably do, but it's a little bit more important in this case because if you have a duplicate and one reviewer included the record and another reviewer excluded the duplicate record, it will confuse the AI because it doesn't know if that's an included text or excluded text. And title only records, that's always a challenge. If you have title only records, it can really misinform the AI. You can have a lot of over inclusion. But I mean, there's different strategies. You might want to just quarantine those at the beginning and tackle them at the end, or there's different ways that you can do that. So you build your initial training set. It's really, an important one, because as soon as you have one included study, that's where the AI really kicks in and starts learning. So, oftentimes when we're doing a review, we've already done a protocol or maybe a grant application. So we actually know some of the studies that we are going to include. So we call that an informed training set. So we actually go in and cherry pick those out to include them to make sure that our first training set has really good included studies to learn from. And then ongoing screening, determine your method. Some people use the dual independent, liberal accelerated, where you have one person to include a record, two people to exclude, and how you're going to perform ongoing conflict resolution, if you're going to resolve them or you're just going to have them in limbo. And then, how you might decide, and we'll talk more about this later, how you might truncate your screening. So if you want to determine your stop or modified screening point. So for example, if the software tells you that you have identified 95% of the included records, at that point, there's many things you can do on how you continue screen moving forward. And it really allows you to optimize your team. So, you might have your senior reviewer or clinical expert involved during the first part of screening. And once you get to a point where most of the records you're looking at are being excluded, might be a good point to move your senior reviewer onto other stages of the review process. That might require a little bit more knowledge, like data, full text screening or data extraction or risk of bias assessment. So this is from Distiller. It's just a pictorially described way of how the AI interacts with your review screen. So it's basically what I've been talking about. So you have your review team screen, it informs the AI prioritizes while the review team is still screening. And then you might have your senior reviewer part of the screening process. They could be running the AI audit tool in the background, and we'll talk more about that later, or proceed with further steps. So okay, so these considerations are, I've been talking about them a little bit throughout the process. So the first, the informed training stat I've talked about. This is particularly important when you're expecting few included studies, because as I said, the AI really starts to learn once you've identified at least one included study. So if the first few iterations are all excluded studies, it hasn't really learned anything yet. So if you're covering a topic that is where you're expecting few included studies, it's really good to try to get in there and identify at least one of those included studies that you might know about. Just a note to say the liberal accelerated screening, where you have one reviewer include a record and two reviewers to exclude a record. This may result in over-inclusion. It often does from experience, and it will you will end up with a less accurate training set, because if you're including too many records that shouldn't really be included, well, the AI is learning from this. So they're going to assign scores to records similar to those as likely to be included. So it does decrease the accuracy of your training set if you're over-inclusive. When you're screening at random, some records you might notice are fairly quick to exclude. Excluded records are often quicker to exclude than included records, because for a record to be included, you really have to read through everything to make sure it checks all of your boxes. Whereas if you're excluding a record, it might be something, in the first sentence of the methods where you can say, oh no, this is excluded. So when you're looking at the records in prioritized order, the most likely to be included records will be displayed first. So these, the start of your screening will initially take longer for this reason. But once you get to a point where you're pretty much excluding all of the records, it does pick up again. So, your review team might be wondering, like, why is this taking so long to screen? And you might want to tell them that's why. So, and as I mentioned before, a record in conflict will not contribute to the machine's learning, because it will not know whether that's an included or an excluded record. So it is important to perform conflict resolutions at intervals, and that might depend on how many people you have on your review team, and how many records are being screened in a day or a week. So as I said, what's my timing here? As I said, it really is a continuum of the AI involvement. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing. And you can also change your level of AI involvement throughout the screening process. You might, I think it also really depends on the review topic that you're doing. If you're doing a rapid review, for example, and you're okay, excuse me, you've taken in account that you're okay if you miss a study, then you can get the AI to be involved a little bit more. If you're doing a full systematic review where you want to make sure you really capture every study, because it is so important to capture everything, then maybe you use the AI just to show the records in prioritized order. You may also choose, so I can go through all of these, but it's just really the continuum. And there's a table about this in one of the publications as well. But sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so but you can. So the first one is dual independent screening. As I said, this is just showing you the records in prioritized order, and you can organize your team strategically using this approach. You could have the AI reviewer involved, and different levels of conflict resolution or not. You know, all the way to number 8, where basically say, oh, look, it's told me I've identified 95% of the included records. I'm not even going to screen the rest of the records. We're just going to assume they're excluded, or I'm going to get the AI tool to exclude them on my behalf. You know, so you might start with a less, like a more conservative approach at the beginning, where the AI reviewer, the AI tool is only showing you the records in prioritized order. But once you get to a certain point, you might say, oh, okay, well, now I'm going to just, I'm just going to get one reviewer to screen the rest of the records, and I'm going to move the rest of my team over to the next steps. So sorry, I know that was a bit scattered, but happy to talk about these examples in more detail. I just want to make sure we have time to talk about the rest of the slides. Okay, so actually we have tons of time. Okay, so how I'm working at the Canadian Association of Radiologists, and we're developing 13 guidelines for diagnostic imaging. So I'll just briefly describe how we're using this in practice at my current job.
Actually, Candice,
Yes,
we do have a question
sure,
in the chat, maybe before you go into the examples.
absolutely.
Yeah, so what are the underlying machine learning or NLP methods used to identify the records, if you have any sort of high level response to that?
Yeah, so I think that's going to, I'm not a computer scientist, so I don't know a ton about the underlying mechanisms. It's kind of a black box. And, you know, working with the folks at Distiller, it is proprietary, so they don't share that much information, because it is the tool that they've developed, and what gets them people to subscribe to their service. But I think it's, I can't, it's, there's like bag of words, and there's SVM. There's different tools, and I think that's really going to depend on the tool that you're using. So I can't really speak to that, because it's going to differ based on the tool. Sorry, I can get more information on that if you have any particular tool that you're interested in particular. But yeah, often that information is, well, I mean, they'll tell you the general tool that they're using, but they definitely won't go into details, because that's really their how they're making their money, right? It's secret. So
Okay, thanks.
yeah. Okay. So yeah, so we're developing guidelines. So because we're looking at guidelines and looking at the recommendations that that these other guideline groups are making, but we're just using these to inform our discussions, and we're contextualizing the recommendations that we're producing, using the concepts found in GRADE. So the benefits and harms, the resources, equity, accessibility, all of those concepts that you find in the evidence to decision framework. So we're, you know, and I'm doing some supplementary searching as well. I'm looking at, you know, the NICE guideline website and that kind of stuff. So I'm fairly confident that we're identifying all of the guidelines that are relevant to any particular clinical scenario we're covering. If we were to miss one for this particular project, not a huge deal. You know, if we found 4, is the 5th guideline really going to contribute any different recommendations? It might, but maybe it's not related to the Canadian context anyway. So we've decided as a guideline group that we're okay that if we were to miss a guideline for a particular scenario. So we're taking a fairly liberal approach to how we're using AI. So we have a single reviewer screening the records. Because I know I go into the American College of Radiology and the NICE, I kind of do my supplementary searching beforehand, and I revisit it once I get my data set. But I go in and I say, okay, like what kind of guidelines am I expecting to find? So that really helps me build an informed training set. So I go in and I cherry pick those out and I include them right from the get-go. So I'm really getting a good training set for my AI to learn from. Distiller, I don't know how common this feature is in other software tools that have AI, but they have these things called audit checks. So what you do is you just click on a button and basically it goes through all of the records that you have screened and it assigns the inclusion score. If the score is 0.85 or greater, it will highlight these records to say, you excluded this record, but it actually has an inclusion score which might point to actual inclusion. So it gives you an opportunity to rescreen this set of records that you have maybe incorrectly excluded. And I kind of do this throughout the process because, as I said, the AI is learning based on my includes and excludes. So if I've excluded something incorrectly, well, then I want to make sure that I include it so that it can learn from that's actually an included record. I am also using, once I hit 95%, and Distiller shows me this really nicely, of the predicted relevant references, I stop at that point. And then do a couple of extra steps, which I'll show you on the next screen. And as I said, there is some empirical research, not only the study that we did with the simulation tool, but there is also Swift Active Screener. They're programmers down in the US at Brown University, I think. And they have done a lot of empirical studies with their software to show that 95% of the predicted relevant records, you're really closer to 98, 99, or even 100% of the records that you will ultimately include. And I have found I've done this for 7 projects now, for 7 guidelines that I've done. And I usually get I hit that 95% within the first 40% of my total records. So quite large reduction in the screening burden. Then I get the AI reviewer to exclude the remaining records. It's kind of a screen once, I just set it up so that the AI reviewer excludes those. Then I run the audit tool again, because I want to say, well, was anything that was excluded, maybe incorrectly excluded. So I go through those records, I rescreen them just to make sure that they were properly excluded. So these are just a few of the diagrams that that Distiller shows you. So you can see the leftmost diagram. It shows 95%. So in this particular study, it says of the 171 records that it is predicting that would be included, I have identified 164 of them already. And you can see there's a little calculation there, and it shows you how they've come up with that number. And it has to do with how many records you've excluded in the past several iterations, how many records are remaining to be screened, etc. And it shows you a nice line chart. You can see that, pretty steep at the beginning, and then it really starts to flatline at the end. And again, it shows you a bar chart of the remaining records that have not yet been screened, in this case, 3,592. That they all fall in that 0 to 9% likelihood of inclusion category. And you may have noticed in the 2020 Prisma tool, like reporting tool, it does say, if you do use AI in your screening process, then this is the type of information that you should report on. So when I write up my guideline and my method section, I say, we identified 95% of the records. Of the remaining records, the top, and Distiller will show you the actual top score. The likelihood of inclusion of the highest record was 6.8%. What that means to people is subject to their own interpretation, but at least you're making that, you're being transparent in your approach. So, but we want to make sure we are believers in the AI tool, but not everybody is. So we do add some extra verification in our process with another human screener. So we get the software to select a random set of 30% of the records, of all the records, which includes 10% of the included records and 20% of the excluded records. And we get the human screener to screen these without knowledge of what the include or exclude decision was of the first reviewer. And then any conflicts that come up here are resolved between the two screeners. As I said, I've done this 7 times now, and with this exact process, and amongst the conflicts that happen with this, every single conflict, there aren't many, but every single one of them is between the two human screeners. It has never been between the human screener and the AI reviewer. So, and then once this is done and all the conflicts have been resolved, I run the AI audit tool again, just to make sure that nothing has been excluded, because if there's been conflicts and we've now included a record or two that were originally excluded, we want the AI audit tool to re-look at the records to see, okay, well, now is there something that we've excluded that might point towards inclusion? So happy to talk. So the next couple slides are really just the advantages and some of the challenges that you might encounter using AI. So the advantages, there's really, as I mentioned before, you shouldn't have to make concessions when you're developing your search strategies. So we can really harness the power of, sorry, in this AML is active machine learning. We harness the power of the AI, the active machine learning, to demote the least relevant records while maintaining a record of these. So we have them, and we can get the AI reviewer to screen them and do the audit to check, well, should they maybe have been included, and at least then we have a record of all the potentially relevant records. Because we're screening in prioritized order, we're really identifying the most relevant records first. These are the records going to full text screening, and this allows for quicker procurement of these full texts and screening of them and data extraction and risk of bias of the included studies. You can really work with your team's level of experience and spread them across the different stages sooner. If you have a review that has 30,000 records, well, you're probably going to be all hands on deck for title and abstract screening for the first little while to try to get through those. The nice thing about this is, as I've mentioned many times, you can be more strategic with your team members and spread them across the different stages sooner. You can, and once you've identified most of your included studies or what the software has predicted to be included, you can get your more junior reviewers to screen the records that are likely just going to be excluded. And the nice thing about having the data extraction and risk of bias done earlier on in the process is, if you're working with knowledge users or you're doing a rapid review, for example, this allows for ongoing conversations. They don't have to wait, a month to 6 months for you to get through screening to even know how many records that you need to review at full text. It really allows for ongoing conversations with them earlier in the process, and this keeps people keep people more engaged as well. So some of the challenges that you might encounter is some of the advantages can also become challenges, is your team management. So only the full reviewed records can contribute. If something needs to be reviewed, if a record needs to be reviewed by 2 reviewers to decide whether it's included or excluded, sometimes you have reviewers who are very fast, who get through, or if somebody's off for a week and you only have 1 reviewer screening these records, well, the reprioritization isn't going to happen until that second reviewer has made a decision on the record. So you need to figure out, if that's the case, you might need to change your strategies. The potential for additional conflict resolution. Before AI, we often just used liberal accelerated, one screener to include, two screeners to exclude. So if you had a record where the first screener excluded and the second reviewer included, well, they're in conflict. But we would say, well, just include it. We'll figure it out at full text. But but in this case, you can still do that, but it's not training the AI because it won't really know if it's included or excluded. So your staff might be reluctant to use AI and worry about job security. I hopefully this is less and less as AI is more accepted by people. But really, by strategically organizing your review teams, you might actually it might present with an opportunity to undertake more projects as you're saving time during the other projects. So you can, get there certainly isn't a shortage of reviews to be done. So it just allows your team to maybe take on more projects. And as I said earlier on, you probably should get buy-in from the knowledge users on how you're using AI. And the solution to this is, we're kind of we're getting higher up in the adoption stage for AI for sure. But there are more and more studies, empirical studies being published on AI and how it actually is, does allow time savings and is quite accurate. So this is really just a matter of time before more people actually, they might actually even request that you use AI so that they can get their results faster. There might be other challenges that I haven't pointed out here, but happy to hear from everybody if you have any questions. The Cochrane Rapid Review Methods group did publish interim guidance a couple of years ago, right before COVID or right when COVID had started. We were working on this work prior to it, and not everybody likes rapid reviews. There are limitations to them for sure. But then COVID hit, and all of a sudden everybody wanted, okay, how can we get an answer faster? So we had this guidance that we produced. We are updating it. In addition to that, we have several specific topic articles, and one of them it will be on guidance on the use of supportive software for evidence synthesis. It's not all related to AI. It's really, just different software tools for different stages of the review, but certainly a lot of them do have AI built into them. So if you're interested in receiving that article once it's published, I'd be happy to share it with you. And it might help you in other stages of your review process as well. Okay, so I purposely left hopefully a little bit of extra time because I'm hoping there's some questions and some good discussion around this. I would be really interested in hearing how some of you have been using AI in your projects as well, because I think it's a good opportunity. There's so many different ways that it can be used, so it's interesting to hear how other people are using it. So even if it's not a question, maybe you can even just tell me how you've used it as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Candice. The results are remarkable, and I think that there are people still a little bit on the fence, worried about, the reliability and what if you missed something, and
Yeah,
how good is the tool? Yeah.
I mean, the tool is only as good as the people you have informing your data set, really,
Mm.
right? So if you don't trust your reviewers performing the actual review, but so your AI will never outperform your reviewers because it is your reviewers who are training it, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. And like I said, it's really a continuum. If all you want it to do is show you the records in prioritized order, and you're going to screen through every single record, that's fine. That is one way of using it, and you distribute your team accordingly. But you can get it involved more within the process, depending on your level of trust and how important it is for you to identify every single included record. But like I said, humans make mistakes as well. So just because you have humans screening every single record doesn't mean that you've identified every single record you should have.
Right. And I think it's interesting that you basically have the cherry picking of the included
Yeah,
as that initial step for the
yeah,
training process.
yeah. It really helps. I'm just gonna so I can see people if they have questions, but it helps because it just starts, you just make sure that you're really informing your data set right from the first stage, and you can see, on that, you depending on how much you inform it at the beginning, your line is going to be steeper, right? And you really identify those records earlier on in your screening, and potentially reduce your screening burden because of it.
We do have questions in the chat. So the first question is from Xiaomei. It's what do you think about free AI tools? Do you think they're worthwhile to be tested for their performance effects?
Yeah, so Abstractor, for example, is a free tool, and I believe Rayan is a free tool as well.
Yes.
Rayan is, I believe, a little bit more sophisticated than Abstractor. As I said, Abstractor, um, like, so for example, in Distiller, it relearns every 2% of your records, whereas Abstractor relearns every 24 hours. So you can get through, if you have a team of 10 screeners, you can actually get through a ton of records in one day where you're not actually, it's not learning anything just yet because it hasn't gone through that learning process. Whereas Rayan is it's more supported, it's a bit more sophisticated. And I have not tested it, so I can't speak to the accuracy of its AI, but I think depending on the level of AI involvement you're having, um, then, I think that the free tools could also definitely help you in your process as well.
Okay. Thanks. Um, and there's a question from Asharbani. Is your experience in your experience, what could be the guiding factors to pick a tool?
Ooh. Well, I mean, I guess will be largely based on budget. So some of these tools are definitely more expensive than others. And to me, it's like, if you've ever used robot reviewer, so it's the risk of bias tool, right? And I attended a presentation, and there's publications on this tool from the developers, but it doesn't make it any less valid. They've evaluated the time savings of how much time the robot reviewer can save you when you're doing your risk of bias assessment, as it only answers the first four questions, blinding, randomization, allocation, concealment. It's something like 7 minutes. Okay, well, 7 minutes doesn't seem like that much time, but what if you have 200 included studies? That's a ton of time, right? So it's the same thing with the AI during your screening. Maybe the tool that you're using isn't as sophisticated, because you don't have the budget, or maybe your institution requires you to use a specific tool. Maybe it's not going to save you as much time as the most sophisticated tool is going to do for you, but an hour here, an hour there is going to make a difference, if you're particularly if you're an institution that does a lot of reviews, right? And I find now, regardless of what the topic is, the yields from the search strategies just seem to be increasing every time. It's not unheard of to have a yield of 20, 30, 40,000 records, which is just wild. That takes a long time for humans to do. So yeah, so in terms of how you pick the tool, I guess it really just, they all offer something. They're all good. I think the AI behind it, because AI for title and abstract screening has been in use since like 2010, so it is not new. The adoption of it is new. There's been computer programmers working on this stuff for many years now, so it is quite sophisticated for title and abstract screening, less so for data extraction and that kind of stuff. So I mean, I guess I would just say, look at your budget first. If you need free, then look at the free tools and compare what functionality they have. If you're okay to spend money, then look at the tools that cost. And there's going to be variation in that as well. Level of support too, it's really nice to have somebody who's going to answer your questions. So that level of support, like, yeah, different tools have different levels of support as well. So yeah, sorry, I don't know if that
Yeah.
completely answers the question, but
Well, and just you showing the audit features that you have within Distiller, some of those other additional features might be different
yeah.
in the
And
other tool.
like this diagram, I have tested some of these other tools that cost. They have given me like a free kind of 30-day thing just so I can kind of dig in a little bit. But that was 2 years ago, and these tools are constantly being upgraded and developed as software tools are. So I can only speak to what they were back then. But for example, at that time, and this, like I said, I don't want to speak for the tool now, but one of the tools that I used didn't have diagrams like this. So I couldn't tell, like, where am I? Have I only identified of 50% of what it's predicting that I'm going to identify? So to me, like, this is a screen in Distiller, and I use it a lot because I don't want to screen one more record than I absolutely have to screen. So it really depends on that level of sophistication and how involved you want to be. You can have AI completely running in the background where nobody even knows that you're seeing the records in prioritized order, or you can be really involved in it by looking at this type of screen and saying, okay, I've hit 95%. I'm done. I'm not going to do anything else. No more screening at this point.
Okay, thanks. And then, so I think just actually as a follow-up with the 95%, Tamara's question is, when you mention 95% of the records, is that 95 of them screened, or it's at the point of no longer seeing records that are included?
So
Yeah.
yeah, so basically it's taking up from the records you've screened, you've included a certain amount. And then it says amongst the remaining records, we only think you're going to identify 5% more that you're going to include. But because you've been screening in prioritized order, this 5% is lower on that likelihood of inclusion, right? Maybe your first records were like 100% likelihood of inclusion or 99% likelihood of inclusion, whereas this last 5% may be closer to like 86% likelihood of inclusion. So it still meets that threshold that Distiller is saying, you'll probably include this record. But as I showed in the simulation project, that 5%, they were never included in the final review. So
Right. Thank you. I do have a follow-up question to that, because I am using Distiller for a systematic review, and I did use the machine learning, but there are so many records that it seems that we've reached that point of no longer excluding records, especially records that are going to make it through the full screening process. But I'm wondering, would this be a point where because we were using dual screening with conflict resolution,
yeah.
where you can use the machine plus one screener to review the records that are left over as being, yeah.
So what I would do in that case, so I would get, because Distiller lets you do this, I would get the AI reviewer to exclude the remaining records. And then I would get the human reviewers to you can keep that kind of dual independent like method. And so then you just have one human, like it might be 10 screeners, but one person to screen each remaining record, which, like you said, will mostly all be excluded, unless it's like an unclear abstract or a title only type record where the human might say, I don't know, I'm going to include this. But yeah, that's what I would do. I would get the AI, or you can just switch to single reviewer screening at this point and just change your inclusion, your like how many reviewers to include and how many reviewers to exclude. You can also just change that to one. But then at that point, you can no longer call it dual independent. You would call it single reviewer screening, right?
Okay, so dual independent, you would get the AI to exclude all records?
Yeah, there's a screen, and I'm happy to connect with you and I can show you how to do it offline.
That would be fantastic.
You just get the AI reviewer to exclude the remaining records, and then you keep your 2 to include, 2 to exclude, set.
Mhm.
You don't change that in your level workflow, and then the reviewers would, so every time a record is screened, it's been screened twice now,
Mhm.
by the AI reviewer and the human reviewer, and then it moves likely to the excluded pile. Yeah,
Thank you.
no problem.
Thanks. Another question is, what's the difference between creating an informed screening set and feeding the AI eligible studies?
Nothing. We've just given the name informed because basically we've informed it. We've made it smarter from the beginning. Yeah,
So
just
it knows what it needs to recognize.
exactly, by giving it included studies right from the start. Because you might not, if you're screening at random, you might not capture those studies until the first iteration, or if your first 2 iterations have captured no included studies because it's presenting them in random order, then you might not capture them right away. So we just like to give it some good information from the beginning.
Thanks. Does anybody have an experience they want to share with Candice about how they're using AI? Because Tamara did.
While somebody might be thinking of something, just to say, another way that this tool can be used is, say you're updating a review or you're doing a living review. So you get a new set of data, say every year you run the search again, you get that data, you plunk it in. Basically at that point you say re-rank, and basically it uses, so you would add your new data into the same silo as your original study, and you can label them, to update or however you want, so you can identify them differently. But right away it can learn because you've already done all of your screening from the first time around. So it will automatically, after you click the re-rank now button, it will show you your records in prioritized order and really highlight the most relevant records first. So it can help you too when if you're doing a living review or an update.
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing use of it, so that we can definitely get evidence out faster.
Yep.
Yeah. One thing I noticed when you shared your 10 reviews across the different topics, the number of articles was different in terms of what was left not to screen. Do you find that it's actually, and I guess it makes sense depending on how broad or how the topics are written.
It's how, yeah, are you including only RCTs, or are you looking at observational studies? That's going to change things. Like if you're doing a scoping review where you have kind of a broader inclusion criteria, you might have your reduction might be a bit less because you're capturing maybe different different concepts. Whereas if you're doing, a systematic review of interventions looking only at RCTs, well, it's probably quite narrow. So you're going to have fewer studies that you're including at title and abstract. So that's why there's some variation in that. And it also depends, like our depression screening review, I think we had 1 included study.
Oh.
So
Not
yeah.
much for it to learn on.
Exactly. And not that we didn't include more at the title and abstract level, but we ended up, so just to show like it's going to depend as well on the number of studies you might end up with as well, because if you're going to include more at the title and abstract level, well, you're going to need to screen more to get those records, right? So yeah, so that's why there's some variation. And also, this, as I said, this was a retrospective evaluation. So maybe some of these we had team members who tend to be a little bit more over inclusive because they don't want to miss anything. So that will impact the how much burden you're reducing as well. So.
Okay, so we've got a couple more questions that have been popping up. I'm just looking at the time. So how long did it take you to train an AI tool before you're confident to let it go by itself on average?
So I use that 95% threshold. Once I hit that 95%, because we've done studies and because other people have done studies, I consider, like, and I mean, it is 95% is probably more than you actually need to be doing. As you can see, like, you know, I got to, in this slide or in this project, for example, I got like, you know, at a little over 750 records that I screened, I was here. I didn't capture that much more by screening an additional almost 1,500 records, right? So I did twice as many records, and I only captured, you know, an extra 14. I can go back and see, well, out of those 14, did any of them actually get included? Like I don't do that, because I figure, well, let's just do 95%. People seem to be comfortable with that 95%. There's been evidence that shows that 95% is an acceptable level. So that's what I use. But and that's what I'm saying, that the AI is really a continuum, because you can say, oh, well, look at now at I can see, you know, say at 1,000 records, I can see my line has already really started to flatline. At this point, maybe I changed to single reviewer screening, or maybe I changed to liberal accelerated screening. So that's what I meant by, like, you might use several different strategies throughout your screening process as you move along, you know, where you become less and less conservative as you have identified more and more of the records that you've included at title and abstract screening. And
Well,
really, it's, you know, any as we know, anything with evidence reviews, it's all about transparency. Somebody might not like the method that you use, but as long as you're transparent with it, they can then determine, well, how confident am I that their methodology contributed to a good conclusion, you know? And that's for other people to decide. You've been transparent, you've done what you needed to do. So
right, great. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. There was a question in the chat about the recording. We do post them onto our YouTube channel that I've also linked there. And I've added your email in case anybody had a question, because there was somebody who wanted the citations for the work that you've done.
oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm happy I believe they're all published open access. So although I could share even if they weren't, obviously. Yeah, happy to share any of the publications, not just the ones that I was on. You know, if you need them to support, you know, your methods, I can send you those as well. Yeah, happy if you know, if you're using this and you're like, hey, can you just help me, like Tamara, please connect with me. Happy. I love this stuff. And I want it to make people's life easier, because it's really been life-changing in terms of how quickly we can get through our reviews. So I find it very exciting. So if you're interested, let me know, and I'm happy to help.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that, definitely interesting, and I can imagine that we've got new things coming down the further steps in our processes and
Yeah,
reviews with text summarization
definitely.
and extraction. So thanks, really appreciate your time, and thanks everybody for joining. Very active questions, which is great.
Great. Thanks. Have a good
Thanks.
day, everyone. Bye.
Bye.